Hey everybody, and thanks for joining us.
Welcome to RetroforceGO. Totally awesome sauce!
Welcome to RetroforceGO, and welcome to the official RetroforceGO Episode 1. Hello, and welcome to RetroforceGO Episode 2. And welcome to RetroforceGO Episode 3. And welcome to RetroforceGO. My name's Dyson. I'll be your host today. Joining me on our 4th episode are my friends Colette Bennett.
Hello.
Chad Conselmo.
Trio.
And Topher Cantler.
And welcome to RetroforceGO, episode number 5.
Hello and welcome to Retroforce Theater. And welcome to RetroforceGO, episode I think I forgot. This is your host,
It's
Dyson
7.
Gris. And welcome to RetroforceGO. This week is going to be episode 8. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only retro podcast. I'm your host, Dyson. Joining me, and welcome to RetroforceGO, episode 9. I'm your host, And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only retro podcast. Tonight's show is episode 9. And welcome to RetroforceGO, episode 10.
Ooh, 10.
10?
And welcome to RetroforceGO. This is episode 11. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only retro podcast. It is also the funniest retro podcast on the planet. Yeah, welcome folks. This is episode 13. 12. Episode 12. And welcome to RetroforceGO, episode 13 for real this time. Is it 13 or is it 12? It's 13, right?
13. I don't listen to the shows.
Rev's like, I'm so cool. I only show up and then I never do it again. I don't even read the site. Welcome, listeners. Episode 13. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's most awesomest retro podcast. This week is going to be episode 14. And welcome to a special Ultra Secret Ninja Gaiden episode of RetroforceGO. And welcome to RetroforceGO, episode 15. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's bestest retro podcast. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's bestest podcast ever. Bestest retro podcast ever. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's #1 retro podcast. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's #1 retro podcast. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's #1 retro podcast. This is episode 20. And welcome to RetroforceGO, episode 21, now illegal to drink. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's only retro podcast. This is your host, Dyson. I'll be your host this evening, as I have been for the last 21 episodes. And I'll also be the host tonight on the 22nd episode. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid.com's one and only retro podcast. This is your host, Dyson. And joining me today for a lovely episode 23. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's #1 retro podcast. Hello, listeners. This is your host, Dyson. Hosting this week's episode, Mario Madness Part 2. It's episode 24. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only most awesome sauce podcast. Retro podcast. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoids.com. Is one and only retro podcast. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only retro podcast. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only retro podcast. Currently, Destructoid's only podcast, now that I come to think of it.
No, the podcastle.
And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only retro podcast. This is going to be episode 9, thank you.
9.
And I'm your host, Dyson. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only retro podcast. Joining or continuing along the fine Destructoid podcast that we do have. We have Podtoid, and now we have the Podcastle, and of course RetroforceGO. So we're not the only ones anymore. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's #1 retro podcast. 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 This is going to be episode 34. Thank you.
Double. Welcome to RetroforceGO,
Destructoid's #1 retro podcast.
This is episode...
Dear Lord, have you forgotten again?
And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's #1 retro podcast. This is your host Dyson on episode 35. Yes, Torslan, I do remember. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only retro podcast. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's #1 retro podcast. Welcome to episode 37. Thank you. 37.
Wow, we're getting old.
I know, huh? I'll be 40 soon.
And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's #1 podcast del retro. I'm your not host, Topher Cantler.
And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only retro podcast. Also, the one and only awesomest retro podcast in the world, ever, until we die. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's #1 retro podcast. This is episode 40. Hurrah! That's an even number. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's #1 retro podcast. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only retro podcast. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only retro podcast. This is your host Dyson, hosting episode 43. Joining me, was it 43? Whatever.
And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only retro podcast. And this is Dyson.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen. That was our illustrious Podcastle/Podtoid host, Jim Sterling, the only British person on staff. And welcome, RetroforceGO. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's #1 retro podcast. This is your host Dyson for episode 45. And welcome to Pizza Rolls, the #1 food for Dyson. Not kidding. Welcome to Retroforce, ladies and gentlemen.
And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's #1 retro podcast.
And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only most awesome retro podcast.
And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's #1 retro podcast.
And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only retro podcast. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only awesome retro podcast.
And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's one and only retro podcast. And welcome to RetroforceGO, Destructoid's #1 retro podcast. And welcome to RetroforceGO. And welcome to RetroforceGO. Destructoid's one and only retro podcast. And welcome to RetroforceGO. Yeah. And welcome to RetroforceGO, episode number 57? Is that right?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, I
Who
think you're
cares?
right.
Whatever.
We're Destructoid's #1 and only retro podcast.